It was one of those early fall days that inspired poets to write and artists to paint. The sky was a peaceful blue. Leaves floated on the whispering breezes like autumn-colored confetti, and the birds sang worshipful melodies. For those who may have allowed the brokenness of this world to rob them of their sense of wonder at the beauty of such a day, the shock of finding a dead man could have tricked them into believing that life was meaningless. Though Rory Boudreau and Stevie Muse stared at the blackened and bloated body of Curtis Bronson sitting inside his jacked-up Dodge Ram, they retained an innocence that would not allow the gloriousness of the day to be diminished, nor would it allow this dark moment to taint their belief that life was a gift to be cherished. Both boys were 12 years old and fatherless. Stevie's dad had left the day he was born, and Rory's had been killed by a voodoo queen in New Orleans. They lived with their mothers in the Pink Flamingoes trailer park, which had seen the last of its good days 50 years ago, and was now inhabited by the types of people that society chose to ignore. The park had been built during the space age, and the streets and lanes were named with a nod toward that era. At the entrance of the park sat an old sign that displayed 2 large flamingos and pink and teal neon script. At night, some of the letters burned more brightly than the others. If you read only those letters, they spelled In Flames Trailer Park. And most of the folks who lived there would say that it was a fair declaration of the state of that sad little community. The park itself was only a small part of a larger community called Nevermore Hollows, which is one of those strange places scattered around the world where the veil between the natural and the supernatural realms is thin, allowing all manner of paranormal actions between the two. The boys had experienced a lifetime of adventures in the years since they'd become friends. They had fought the ghost of a serial killer, had been kidnapped by a man who carved his face with a razor blade to resemble a jack-o'-lantern, and had become the sworn enemies of a demon-possessed monkey who called himself Psycho Juju. And through it all, they had grown as close as brothers. And surprisingly, they had found a father figure in Ivan Ivanovich, the park's live-in custodian. Ivan looked to be a fit 50 years old, but the boys thought that he was much older. He wore his hair in a buzz cut and carried himself like a soldier trying to find peace after seeing too much war. He was a man of few words, but had come to care deeply for the boys, and had made a solemn oath to not just protect them from harm, but to teach them how to defend themselves. Ivan stood beside the boys and grimaced at the body sitting in the driver's seat. "Anybody else seen this?" "Nope," Stevie said. With his slim build, red hair, and freckles, he looked as if he were the subject of a Norman Rockwell painting. "We were riding our bikes and came upon him sitting here in this vacant lot. Then Rory went to get you while McCready and I stayed to make sure nothing happened." McCready was a husky border collie mix that had shown up a few weeks back. He had adopted the boys, and they had accepted him as their dog. McCready looked up at Ivan and chuffed, as if to say, "I would never leave Stevie alone with a body, especially not in this bizarre trailer park." Rory had dark hair and dusky skin and spoke with a Cajun patois. "Ain't nobody dies in this trailer park from natural causes," he said. "This place has all kinds of spooky stuff happening, like them bites he got on him." Ivan had already called the sheriff. He was careful not to contaminate the scene, but He leaned closer and looked at the body through the open window. There were dozens of small puncture wounds on his face, neck, hands, and forearms. Ivan looked at Rory. "You said he was Curtis Bronson. How do you know him?" "We met him at Pennywise ice cream parlor the other night," Stevie said. "He was kind of a douche. Sorry for my language, sir. But he is. He tried to ask the girl who works there out on a date, but she shot him down." "It sure was ugly," Rory said. "But we heard him tell her his name." "Is there anything else you know about him?" Ivan asked. "Well, last night we was in town getting our comic books over at Romero's Comics and Games," Rory said. "And there is this new tavern on Main Street called the Drunken Cryptids. When we left Romero's, we seen Curtis leave there with a woman." "Yeah, and she's that woman that all the redneck guys are drooling over," Stevie added. "I've seen her," Ivan said, recalling the thin young woman who had recently moved into Lot 88. She was trailer park pretty in her tight jeans, cowgirl boots, and form-fitting Morgan Wallen concert shirt. She always kept her long, coppery hair pulled through the back of a trucker hat. "She's Laney Lambert. What do you know about her?" The boys exchanged a glance. Rory nodded for Stevie to continue. "Well, whenever we see her out, we both feel kind of weird, like you do when you take that cold medicine that makes you feel woozy." Ivan frowned. He didn't like this information. "Yeah, I get the same feeling when I see her out. That concerns me, boys. Anything else you've noticed?" Before they could answer, they heard vehicles approaching. Sheriff Cotton Mosley drove up in his 1955 Willys 4x4 truck, which he had lovingly restored to its rugged glory. He was followed by Alyssa Hart, the coroner and medical examiner, who was driving her 1966 blue and white VW bus that she used instead of a black van to transport bodies. They parked, exited their vehicles, and walked over to Ivan and the boys. Cotton was a man of average height, but carried himself with a confidence that inspired trust. Alyssa had red hair and kind eyes and treated everyone as if she were their favorite aunt. They exchanged pleasantries, and then Cotton tipped back his Stetson when he saw the condition of Curtis's body. "Well, that's nasty," he said. "Hit me." Ivan had the boys tell Cotton and Alyssa what they'd told him, including the strange sensation they got when they were around Laney. Stevie finished by saying, "Do you think she killed him?" "And you think she'd be a witch or something?" Rory added. This was a valid question, because one of the park's more infamous residents was an ancient old witch named Granny Dingo, who kept her long gray hair in a bun that was held in place by a withered chicken's claw. Nobody knew her real name, and she was called by that quirky moniker because she was followed around by her near-rabid dingo dog named Manson that she had somehow sneaked into the country. "Well, I'm not sure if Laney's a witch, Rory," Alyssa said. "And seeing her with Curtis last night isn't enough evidence to suggest she killed him. Though she probably did, our evidence is circumstantial at best. And I've never seen her, therefore I haven't experienced the fuzziness of the mind you guys describe." Most of the residents of Nevermore Hollows did not believe in such things as witches or monsters, and those who did chose to ignore the strange and often deadly things that happened in the area. For that reason, Cotton, Alyssa, Ivan, and a few others had formed a group to stand against these dark forces. Alyssa had been quietly putting together a database on the paranormal creatures they encountered, and was quickly becoming the expert on such things. "I might have an idea as to why you all felt strange around her," she said. I'm thinking it's a glamour spell, like in those old movies where vampires will put someone in a trance so that they can control them. Some of the lore I've read about glamour spells suggests that they make you feel a little drunk. Stevie's eyes glittered with curiosity. So, you think she might be a vampire? Alyssa shook her head. Not necessarily. From my research, I found that other paranormal creatures can use glamour spells. Besides, we've only had one documented vampire attack around here, and the wounds on Curtis don't look anything like the wounds left on those victims. These wounds are too small and close together, not to mention that there are so many of them. Cotton had seen enough dead bodies to make his own keen observations. This body seems rigid, but not due to rigor mortis. And though the discoloration would seem that he's been dead for days, we know he hasn't. What do you make of these inconsistencies? Alyssa snapped on gloves and began a closer examination of the body. Well, you're correct. The body feels as hard as stone, but not from rigor. Curtis was wearing a Coors Light t-shirt. She pulled it up to examine his torso. And it seems as if his whole body has turned black. Before I can give you a definite answer, I'll need to get him back to my office and conduct an autopsy. Cotton took a moment to consider his next move. Because of the layout of this community, it will be too difficult to set up surveillance on Laney's trailer. It will be too obvious and she'll know that we're on to her. But I'll have a deputy set up at the entrance of the park. We'll make it look like a speed trap, and we can monitor when Laney comes and goes. I'll patrol inside the park, Ivan said. I'll coordinate with your deputy when they get here. Cotton and Ivan helped Alyssa get Curtis into a body bag. Cotton had called for a tow truck, and it arrived while they were loading him into the back of Alyssa's bus. After the truck was taken away, Cotton and Alyssa left. Ivan turned to the boys and McCready. Stay away from Laney. You've had enough dangerous adventures lately. Let this go. Stevie and Rory presented Ivan with innocent looks that failed to hide their mischievous nature. We just gonna ride around a bit more this evening, Rory said. Ivan knew that these boys respected him, but long ago he had also been an adventurous boy. As much as he wanted to believe they would not let their curiosity get them into trouble, he knew better. He pointed at McCready. Protect them, he said. McCready locked his eyes onto Ivan's. He chuffed and nodded, as if to say, with my life. Because McCready had already once saved the boys from what seemed certain death, Ivan trusted the dog more than he trusted any man other than Cotton Mosley. So he turned, stalked over to the pink and white golf cart that belonged to the park, and which he had modified with a gas engine, and shot off down the lane. When Ivan was out of sight, Rory said, I say we go find Laney and investigate. We can't be completely sure she did this, Stevie said. I mean, it's kind of stupid to dump a body in the place where you live. Rory waved his arm around at the trailer park. You done seen the people who be living in this park, Stevie? Is any of them smart? Stevie shrugged. Good point. But Ivan is right in saying we've gotten into a lot of dangerous situations lately. Maybe we need to sit this one out. The dynamic between the boys was that Rory was the impulsive one who got them into trouble, and Stevie was the calculated one who figured a way out. With a mischievous gleam in his eyes, Rory considered what Stevie said. Just because we're going to try and find this girl don't mean we got to talk to her. We just find her and watch and see what happens. Right? Stevie reached out and rubbed McCready's back as he thought, causing the dog to give a happy wag of his tail. Okay, I'm in, but if we find her, we don't interact with her. I mean it this time, Rory. Promise me. Rory smiled. Cross my heart and hope to eat maggots. I say we start by riding by her trailer. They got on their bikes and pedaled away, McCready padding between them, alert for any danger. Laney was not at her trailer, and they decided to patrol the park until they found her. Eventually, the sun crept behind the tops of the trees, bringing a deep twilight, and the strings of clear and multicolored Christmas lights that the residents used to illuminate their tiny yards began winking on. They gave a festive glow that did little to dispel the sad state of the park. The boys and the dog rounded a corner and came upon the trailer where Cosmo Cleek lived. Cosmo claimed to be 40, but looked to be 100. He was small, wrinkled, and bald. No matter the weather, he always wore boxers and a t-shirt and a pair of mismatched cowboy boots. He topped it off with a tattered flannel bathrobe which he called his magical cloak. He sat in an aluminum lawn chair with green and white webbing, awash in the glow of his multicolored strings of lights which were strung upon poles. There was an old Coleman cooler sitting on the ground in front of him that he was using as a table. On top of the cooler was a chocolate cake and a half-gallon of milk, and an old dented jack-in-the-box. There were 2 other lawn chairs placed next to the cooler. As the boys got close, he motioned them over. The boys loved visiting Cosmo. Part of the fun of hanging out with him was that he claimed to be a wise man, though he was usually, but not always, wrong in his prognostications. The boys parked their bikes at the edge of the lot and walked over to Cosmo. He croaked.
"Is that there a dog?"
This was the first time the boys had spoken with Cosmo since McCready had come into their lives. Both nodded, and Stevie said, "Yes, sir. His name is McCready." McCready stopped a few feet away from the old geezer, squinted his eyes, and sniffed. After a moment, he seemed to make up his mind, wagged his tail, and walked over and let the old man pat his head. Cosmo coughed out a laugh.
"Ha-hay!"
Then he leaned over and grabbed McCready's head in both his gnarled hands and peered deep into the dog's eyes. After a long moment, Cosmo simply said,
"Yep."
He let go of McCready and motioned toward the 2 additional lawn chairs.
"Have a seat, boys. Tell me what you 3 been up to."
The boys sat, and McCready wandered over and laid down between them. "We found a body today," Stevie said. Cosmo slapped his knee as if he were having a blast.
"Ain't you boys always in a pickle? Why did you find it?"
The boys had become used to Cosmo's strange style of conversation. "Not sure why we found it," Stevie said, "but it was gross." "It was a man sitting in his truck," Rory added. "He was all black and bloated." Cosmo leaned forward in his chair.
"We can discuss more while we eat. You didn't know you'd be by tonight, but Melvin and I did."
Melvin was the jack-in-the-box that sat on the cooler. Cosmo never used a crystal ball in his prognostications. Instead, he would ask Melvin a question, then crank the twisted little handle while listening to the twinkling music until the clown popped free and whispered the answer. He claimed that the dented and rusty toy was a portal to another realm where the mysteries of life were revealed, though he did admit that those revelations were not always accurate. Cosmo handed them each a fork and motioned at the cake, indicating that instead of cutting separate slices, the boys should dig in. He did, however, produce 3 vintage Looney Tunes novelty glasses from where they'd been sitting in the grass and filled them with milk. He handed Rory a Wile E. Coyote glass and a Bugs Bunny to Stevie. He kept a Pepe Le Pew for himself. The boys dug into the cake, and Macready gave a hungry whine. "Sorry, boy," Stevie said. "Chocolate is bad for dogs."
No worries. Melvin said you'd bring a furry friend, but we thought it would be a cat.
He reached inside the pocket of his tattered flannel cloak and produced a baggie of cat treats. He tossed a couple to Macready, who gobbled them up and wagged his tail, clearly not offended by the feline treat.
Now, what do you think caused this man to die?
Stevie shoveled a forkful of cake into his mouth and said, "Don't know, but he had a whole bunch of puncture marks on his hands and face and arms." "Miss Alyssa, the coroner, she says she can't quite figure out what they be," Rory said. He wiped a smear of chocolate from his lips with the back of his hand and took a swig of milk.
I see.
Cosmo leaned back in his chair and pulled at his chin with his gnarled fingers, as if in deep pontification. Finally, he said,
It's a woman that did it, and she makes you woozy. It could be her hair.
The boys glanced at each other, surprised that he'd guessed correctly about it being a woman. But before they could ask him what he meant about her hair, Ivan pulled up in his golf cart. He parked and walked over to them. Cosmo eagerly scooted forward in his chair and said,
Well, look here. Ivan is going to tell us about the snakes.
Ivan stopped dead in his tracks and squinted at the old geezer. After a moment he said, How did you know? Cosmo gave Ivan a look that suggested he was the sage of the ages.
I'm a wise man, Ivan. I keep telling people, but nobody listens.
Ivan took a beat before answering, then said, He's correct. Alyssa called. The puncture wounds on Curtis are from snake bites, and his body is full of copperhead venom, which is what caused the discoloration. Cosmo gave a happy chuckle that was out of place during a conversation about death.
What a hoot!
Ivan grimaced at the old man, then continued. She counted over 100 bites on the body. She thinks he somehow got into a nest or was trapped in a place full of the snakes. Cosmo snatched up the jack-in-the-box.
Let's see what Melvin thinks about all this.
Then he gave the handle a couple cranks, and the creepy, dirt-stained clown popped free. After a beat, as if he were listening to a voice the others couldn't hear, he frowned and said,
Oh no, that can't be right. I don't like this one, not at all. Boys, do what Ivan says and leave this one alone. Now, I think it's best you both get home, maybe hang out, read some comic books, but don't go after the girl. It will end badly for one of you.
The boys looked believable when they told Cosmo they wouldn't pursue their investigation. They stood and thanked him for the milk and the cake. Ivan gave Cosmo an appreciative nod and walked with Macready and the boys to the street. Cosmo may be crazy, Ivan said, but he is correct just enough that you need to take heed with what he just said. Be careful. He got into the golf cart and drove off. The boys rode around for a few minutes, mulling over whether to read comics or to find Laney. The idea of adventure was too strong, and they made the decision to continue their investigation. But first, since they were dealing with snakes and would likely need to chop off their heads, they ran by Rory's trailer and grabbed a couple machetes that used to belong to his dad. Rory also grabbed a can of his mother's hairspray and a long-handled butane lighter. After retrieving their weapons, they made their way to Laney's trailer. They turned off Mercury Lane onto Aldrin Lane and saw a black Ram truck drive by with a man they had seen before. His name was Carson Bowden. Laney sat snuggled up beside him. The boys and McCready followed the truck to Laney's trailer. They parked their bikes a few lots down and sneaked around the back, carefully looking for any snakes. They quietly climbed the dilapidated deck and peered through the back window. McCready stood guard behind them, looking for any threat, prepared to protect them. They were able to see the couple standing in the living room. Carson was tall and beefy. He wore jeans and a camouflage shirt. He had a dreamy look on his face, and when he spoke, his words were slightly slurred, as if he'd been drinking. He was clearly under Laney's spell. Laney was wearing her normal attire of boots, tight jeans, and Morgan Wallen t-shirt. And when the boys looked at her, they felt that strange fuzziness curl around the edge of their minds. Laney gave Carson a come-get-me look from under the bill of her trucker hat. Carson reached out for Laney. "Come on, baby girl. Give Big Daddy a kiss." Laney positioned herself between him and the front door. She flicked her tongue between her lips. It was both seductive and somehow threatening. "First, I've got something to show you." A confident smile spread across Carson's face. "Oh, yeah? Show Big Daddy what you got." Laney pulled off her trucker hat and shook her long, curly ponytail loose. When she did, Carson's smile was replaced with a look of horror. He stumbled back and bumped into the wall. "What the hell?" he yelled. It was clear that Carson was no longer under the dreamlike spell, and neither were the boys. Later, they would come to realize that Laney had in fact been using a glamour spell, and it was removed when she took off her trucker cap. The boys stood in the dark, in complete shock at what they were seeing through the window. Laney's coppery red hair had turned into a headful of writhing copperhead snakes. They curled around her shoulders and hovered above her head in a serpentine halo, all hissing a deadly chorus. Laney took a step toward Carson. "What's the matter, Big Daddy? You don't want me anymore?" What are you?" Carson stammered. "Oh, I'm something your redneck mind can't comprehend," Laney replied. A couple of the copperheads struck out at Carson, but stopped short of biting him. Carson said, "Damn!" and inched toward the kitchen. "Look, lady, I don't want nothing you got. You just let me go. I won't tell nobody nothing about this." Laney took a step closer to him. 4 of the copperheads struck out and bit him, 1 on the face, another on his throat, 2 on his chest. Carson grunted in pain and stumbled away from her. He tried to run toward the back door. Snake-quick Laney jumped onto his back, wrapped her legs around his waist and her arms around his neck. She opened wide, and 2 retractable fangs unfolded from the roof of her mouth. She leaned forward and sunk them deep into Carson's cheek. Carson fell to his knees, Laney still clinging to his back. He tried to reach behind him and grab her, but the copperheads struck him repeatedly, plunging their fangs into his arms, leaving dozens of wounds. Finally, Carson coughed, and a bloody froth spilled over his lips. Then Laney let go of him, and he fell face first onto the floor. He convulsed for a long moment, then went still. Laney rolled him over and squatted down onto his chest, watching as his skin began to turn black from the poison. Stevie, heart pounding, glanced over at Rory and saw that he'd gone pale. Rory whispered, "What the heck we be looking at?" "She's a Gorgon," Stevie replied, knowing that his friend already knew that and was just reacting to the shock by asking a rhetorical question. Just then, Laney looked up and toward the back door window. It happened too fast for the boys to duck out of sight. Every one of the snakes on her head began to writhe angrily, and Laney hissed in rage. She shot up from Carson's body and ran toward them. The boys jumped off the small deck and ran around the corner of the trailer. McCready stayed behind, getting between the boys and Laney as she shot out the door and down the steps after them. She juked to the left, trying to get around McCready, but he juked with her, baring his teeth and growling. She juked to the right, and McCready gave a commanding bark, stopping her in her tracks. She opened her mouth, fangs collapsing down, and hissed her own warning. The mass of snakes writhed in livid coils around her head and shoulders. The boys made it to their bikes, and Rory gave a short whistle, which was McCready's cue that they were safe. McCready slowly backed away, then turned and ran off after them. Laney gave chase. As she did, she yelled, "You're not going anywhere." Then she began speaking in a slippery, ancient language. The boys pedaled down the lane, McCready running behind them. They made it to the intersection and skidded to a stop. In the lane, blocking their way, were what looked to be hundreds of copperhead snakes. The boys glanced to the lots on either side of them, with the intent to cut through the yards, but they were also writhing with snakes. Laney rounded the corner of her trailer and strode down the middle of the lane behind them, blocking their escape. McCready turned and barked a warning. Laney stopped 20 yards away. A confident smile slithered across her face. "Oh, boys, you should have left me alone. Now you're going to die." Rory glanced at the snakes blocking the intersection. They were slowly moving closer. He looked at the yards on either side of them. Those snakes were also inching toward them. "We gotta do something, Stevie." Stevie pulled his machete from the sheath he had tied to the bike frame. Rory nodded and did the same. McCready stood between them and Laney, and the boys turned toward the snakes that were inching toward them. A snake shot out from the yard beside Rory. He stepped back, swung the machete, and cut the snake in two. Two more struck out at Stevie. He jumped away from one and brought the blade down onto the other one, severing its head. Rory stepped over and severed the head of the second one, but they were forced to relinquish some of their ground and step closer to Laney. "I don't think they're going to bite us," Stevie said. "I think she's used them to push us closer to her so she can kill us." "That ain't going to happen," Rory said. He snatched the can of hairspray from where he'd taped it to his bike frame and the lighter from his back pocket. He flicked the lighter and sprayed a flame at the mass of snakes that were pressing in on them. His intent was to create a path so they could escape. A half-dozen snakes caught fire and writhed in agony, while the other snakes scrambled back, but not enough to create a path through them. Stevie said, "Crap, it was worth a try." Then he twisted and lopped off the head of another snake as it struck toward him. Rory sprayed another blast of fire at the writhing, hissing mass, forcing them back. He shot a glance at Laney. "Why did you kill those guys?" he asked. The look on Laney's face indicated that she didn't think he was worthy of a response. But after a moment she said, "It's how I reproduce." Rory was confused at how that was possible, considering she'd killed Carson before any kind of reproduction he knew of could happen. "Well, that don't make sense." Laney shook her head, her locks of snakes bobbing along as she did. I typically don't reveal my true self to men until after the mating. I already got what I needed from Curtis earlier, and tonight I was just killing Carson for fun." She spoke again in that serpentine tongue, and the snakes that surrounded the boys shot forward, forcing them toward her. McCready growled a warning, but it appeared there was no escape. Just then, they heard the roar of an engine, and from around the corner came Ivan in his souped-up pink and white golf cart. He bounced over the curb, landed amidst the massive snakes in the road, squishing some into a bloody mess, causing the others to scatter away. He turned toward them, causing the cart to momentarily pop up on two wheels. It plopped down, crushing more snakes, and roared past the boys. McCready scrambled out of the way, and Laney hissed in surprise when she saw that Ivan held a sickle with a long, wickedly curved blade in his left hand. She started to turn and run, but before she could, Ivan sped past her and hacked the sickle across her neck, then slid the cart around in a 180-degree arc facing her and the boys. Laney's head spun up off her shoulders, her mouth and eyes wide in shock. Then it landed in the street with a meaty thud. Her body collapsed in a bloody spray. The snakes that surrounded the boys rapidly slithered away back into the black forest, and the snakes atop Laney's head writhed in agonized death throes. For a long moment, nobody moved. They stood silent, processing all they'd seen. Then, Ivan stepped out of the golf cart, grimaced at Laney's body and at the boys. "I told you to let this go," he growled. The boys exchanged sheepish looks. Then Stevie said, "Sorry, Mr. Ivan. We only wanted to get more information so we could give it to Sheriff Mosley and Miss Hart." "But Laney done saw us looking in through her window," Rory said. "She killed Carson Bowden, and we was coming to get you, but she started chasing us, and she had the power over all these snakes." Ivan shook his head. "That's not the point. I promised both of your mothers to keep you safe. Part of that is teaching you when to stand up and walk away. This was a walk-away moment. You didn't need to be involved." The boys looked down at their feet. Even McCready glanced away and gave a whine. Stevie said, "We're sorry, sir." Ivan let the moment linger, then said, "Okay." He snatched his phone and called Cotton and told him what had happened, then hung up. "Is Mr. Mosley mad at us?" Stevie asked. Ivan shook his head. "No. He's glad you two are safe. He and Alyssa are headed this way." 20 minutes later, they arrived and collected Laney's and Carson's corpses into body bags and discarded the dead snakes. Afterward, Alyssa pushed a stray strand of hair behind her ear. "I wonder why Laney was doing all this." "She was mating with him," Stevie said. Alyssa looked surprised. "How do you know that?" "Laney told us," he replied. "Yeah, just before she was going to kill us," Rory added. Alyssa knew these boys well, but was always surprised at their resiliency, at how they could stare directly into the eyes of evil and be so cavalier. She hoped they never lost that gift. "Well then, that's interesting. I'm curious to see what I find when I perform her autopsy. I'll let you all know." She and Cotton said goodbye and left the park. When they were alone, Stevie turned to Ivan and said, "You showed up just in time, sir." "It's because of Cosmo," Ivan grunted. "When I circled back around while patrolling, he flagged me down, Gave me the sickle and told me it was time to kill some snakes at Trailer 88. Told me to hurry or you two boys would be toast. For a moment, they stood in quiet, each considering if Cosmo could be both wise and insane. MacCready broke their pontification with a happy chuff that seemed to say, "Does it really matter?" "Well, we need to go thank him," Stevie said. The boys followed Ivan on their bikes as he drove the golf cart, with MacCready sitting beside him, to Cosmo's trailer. They found the old man just as they'd left him, sitting in the glow of his multicolored Christmas lights, drinking milk from his Pepe Le Pew glass. He'd put out an additional lawn chair for Ivan and motioned for them to take a seat. On the Coleman cooler sat the Jack-in-the-Box and the cake. He handed each of them a fork and motioned for them to dig in. He poured the boys some milk in the glasses they'd used earlier, and some for Ivan in a Yosemite Sam glass. He had more of the cat treats in a Scooby-Doo cereal bowl for MacCready. After he'd completed his duties as a gracious, albeit quirky host, he leaned back and said,
"So, tell me and Melvin about this Gorgon you killed."
Ivan took a sip of milk to wash down a bite of cake. "How did you know it was a Gorgon? We didn't even know until a few minutes ago." Cosmo pointed a gnarled finger at the Jack-in-the-Box.
"Melvin told me."
There was a beat while Ivan and the boys wondered again at Cosmo's sanity. Then they settled back in their chairs, and in the festive glow of the lights, they ate cake, drank milk, and regaled the old man with their story of how they had killed a trailer park Gorgon.